समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Something really dramatic has come about in the world of the news media. I know you are smart, so you must have guessed already what I'm talking about. This is about what's happened in the Washington Post, the same paper which gave us all the president's men, the Watergate scandal, Pentagon Papers, all of the great stories of our generation, in fact of 2.5 generations. This is the paper that produced it. This was the great power paper of the world. This in a dramatic move under the new owner. New means he's been the owner since 2013. Jeff Bezos of Amazon cut more than 1/3 of its editorial staff. It's also cut staff in other areas, marketing, sales, engineers, administrative, but editorial staff. What this also means is that the paper has shut down almost all its major international bureaus, New Delhi, South Asia included. All of these journalists have been laid off. They've got a one-line email saying this is it. The story ends here. 300 people, 300 journalists have been laid off, besides many others. What is exactly the story is, please see in this headline, which I bring up on your screens. This headline says, I read it for you, Washington Post cuts a third of its staff in a blow to a legendary news brand. Hello, which paper is this story from? This is a story in the Washington Post, and this is under the byline of David Bowder. David Bowder, who's an AP reporter. And the story also goes on to look at the reasons why the paper has had this trouble. The paper has had financial troubles because the reason that Jeff Bezos has used, although he hasn't spoken, the reason he's used is that he's losing money. 2023, he lost about 75 million. Those are the estimates I read from a New Yorker article on the subject. In 2024, he lost 100 million. Maybe 2025, he lost more. So he's made these losses. However, losses have to be seen in perspective. He runs Amazon, which is today more than a $2.5 trillion worth. So this money is really small bits for him. We've written a 50-word edit on this, which I will share with you as we go along. Right now, just absorb this story from the Washington Post and the fact that there is still so much freedom. If you go on to read this story, David Bowder's Washington Post story about itself, he tells you that some sections have been shut down. Sports, for example, the team going to Winter Olympics in Italy is not going. Sports, several foreign bureaus. In fact, a majority of foreign bureaus have been shut. The Asia editor has been laid off. Book section has been shut. This has led to a lot of concern about the future of the free press, particularly legacy brands, broadsheet legacy brands, also broadsheet channels who Donald Trump keeps on calling as losing this, failing that, losing this, failing that. It's in this process that Washington Post, one of the greatest news media institutions in the world, has suffered this fate now. In fact, if you see the story in The Atlantic, see the headline. The story in The Atlantic is, we are witnessing a murder. This is an article by Ashley Parker. We are witnessing a murder. That's the kind of mood that we see right now. Again, in the same Washington Post story, quoted is Martin Barron, popularly known as Marty Barron, the legendary last editor of the Washington Post, executive editor. That's how designations work in American media. Executive editor is the editorial boss, and on top of him then is the publisher, who's like the CEO. The publisher in this case is Will Lewis, whereby lies a tale. Will Lewis was hired by Jeff Bezos from News Corp, the Murdoch company, and later it turned out that while he worked for News Corp with its papers in UK, he had been caught or allegedly caught in some phone hacking scandals. He did not want that story published in the Post, fought with the Post editor Sally Busby, which led to Sally Busby's departure. Then he tried to bring in one of his pals from Daily Telegraph and Sunday Times from the Murdoch ecosystem, Mark Winnett, as the editor. Then it turned out that he was also caught in the same phone hacking issues and he withdrew. Lewis, to that extent, had a rocky beginning at the Washington Post. He's the one who now announced these cuts. Matt Murray, the current executive editor of the paper, he explained the shutting down of the sports section. Some people have been retained and they'll be moved into covering the culture of sports. The fact is that Washington Post is not the first paper to shut down the sports section. Breaks my heart also. I also started out as a sports reporter. The New York Times as well shut down its sports section. But what they did was they acquired a publication called The Athletic and started using its content on their website. So to that extent, the New York Times did not dilute its coverage of sport. They just covered sport by acquiring a well-known sports brand. Washington Post right now doesn't seem to be in the mood of doing any of that. In this case, it looks like Jeff Bezos has had enough of running a newspaper, which gets him into trouble with Donald Trump. In fact, the Washington Post had seen the change coming, or should have seen the change coming, in 2024, when Jeff Bezos ordered it to not issue the routine American newspaper endorsement for a candidate, which in this case would have been Kamala Harris. So he had taken a position that the paper will not do it. He also wrote a long note, of which I will see if I can find a copy. I will share it with you on your screen and a link also with you, where he also said, and I'm paraphrasing it, that the opinion section, the editorial section, was looking a bit like it was monoculture. It was as if one ecosystem was talking and he wanted more conservative voices in. Now that might be his worldview. However, when he bought the paper in 2013, he said he was going to be a hands-off owner. And he was hands-off until Donald Trump came back the second time. He was hands-off. He pumped money into the paper. So a paper which had 35,000 subscribers, paid subscribers, when Bezos took over, reached 2.5 million subscribers. Now, when I read about this, I read a long article in the New Yorker. Please see this, check out the bylines. I will share a link with you also. This says that he had a good plan in Trump 1. The paper was critical of Trump. The mood generally in Washington liberal circles was critical of Donald Trump, and it worked. And that's been the paper's readership and following traditionally as well, not very different from that of the New York Times. But once he took the decision, one, to change the nature of the opinion pages and make them more conservative, take out the liberal or left content, and second, when he publicly stopped the paper or paper's editors from endorsing Kamala Harris for president, that put off a lot of the same subscribers. So in just 1 year, just last year, more than 300,000, more than 3 lakh subscribers have withdrawn their subscriptions. So once again, see the issue here. The issue here is that in the media, in polarized time in the media, and it's a challenge that we face all the time because we claim to be unhyphenated. In this polarized era, in fact, it's much more comfortable if you are hyphenated, either to the right or to the left, because then at least that community will pay for you. That is not a path that the New York Times has left. That's a path that the Washington Post left, and they tried to shift more on the conservative side. Once that word spread, then its loyal subscribers, its most loyal subscribers, who were liberal, if not left, they started dumping it. That's the reason Marty Baron, the former executive editor, calls Bezos' decision not to endorse Harris or to block endorsement of Harris as gutless. And he also goes on to say this shows moral infirmity. And he also talks about a sickening effort. I'm quoting from him, sickening efforts to curry favor with Trump. And then he goes on to mention that in the past, when Bezos took over the paper, he had called it among the proudest achievements of his life and he really wanted to see the paper succeed. He also said at that point, he was quoted as saying that I'm like a parent to the paper. I'm creating a runway for money, for capital, so that the paper doesn't have to downsize. He said you can survive by downsizing, by shrinking, but when you shrink, a shrinking business usually leads to extinction. We also know that the Washington Post is the paper that gave us Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Talking to Bob Woodward after he had taken over the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos said that I don't think you can keep shrinking businesses. That's because Washington Post had the prospect of surviving by cutting things down. He said, don't think we can keep shrinking businesses. My intention is to provide a runway of finance for the paper so the paper can grow, because shrinking businesses can usually lead to extinction. That is what Bezos said to Bob Woodward. Then he also said that, look, when they need money, I'm there. I'm like a doting parent. So what changed? What changed dramatically since then? 75 million, 100 million per year is nothing for him because he has a $2.5 trillion business. I'm not saying he owns all of it, but he is one of the wealthiest people in the world. Lately, however, signs were evident that he probably had a buyer's remorse. When you buy something, you say, why did I buy it? Buyer's remorse about Washington Post. He had bought it in 2013 for a notional price of $250 million. That's a notional price. The Graham family sold it to him. He made solemn commitments that he will protect the paper, let editorial be free. Now, one, he vetoed that Harris endorsement. Second, he ordered that the opinion pages should change, take a shift to the right, and made it public, made his memo or his note public. Third, very recently when Washington Post government reporter Hannah Nathanson was raided by FBI, he did not speak up at all. Either to protest or in her defense. All of this had made it evident that he was now done. He was now done with the Washington Post, and he was looking at a much larger universe where maybe this was becoming a problem, a bit of an adanga. And it was in this period that his Amazon also bought the rights for Melania, that is sort of hagiographic documentary on Donald Trump's wife, for $40 million. In the process, as he gutted the editorial view and editorial personality and freedom of the Washington Post, his subscribers left and his numbers came down. I also see a lot of heartburn about the fact that Bezos and his new wife have been seen at really expensive, super luxurious gigs in Europe, and also that Louis, the publisher, was schmoozing in Davos. But you know what? This is his money. He's entitled to spend it as he chooses, or as the saying goes, it's his goat. He can cut it from front or behind. So that is not really the issue. The issue is, why did he buy the Post if he had such a short commitment to it? The New York Times has carried a story which talks about these problems, that now, particularly with AI, all publications are losing traffic because AI just scrapes everything and gives you the wisdom in a digested form. So you don't even go to a link in any publication. All publications are now losing traffic. All publications also have pressure for subscribers because subscribers tend to go to the side where they are ideologically or mentally or philosophically hyphenated. So the NYT story talks about the struggles of all papers, including themselves. In fact, they carry a set of ComScore data. ComScore is what gives you an authentic count of the numbers that a publication has. And they show that all three major papers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post in America, have suffered a loss of traffic. Washington Post has suffered most of all. It also started out being the least of all. And that's why the hit there is the strongest. The New York Times, meanwhile, was smarter. It invested in other businesses. It invested in events. It invested in Wirecutter recommendations for shopping, for buying expensive products. Those have supported the NYT's economics. Those are things that Washington Post did not do. Will Lewis had held a meeting of the staff in 2024, the publisher, and I quote, "We are losing large amounts of money. Your audience has halved in recent years. People are not reading your stuff." However, in 2024 end, Bezos said, we saved the Washington Post once and we are going to save it a second time. Maybe now if you ask him, he will say this is a step in the direction of saving it, because you know what? All newspapers, all publications have this confusion. What do they cover? If I had my way, the print would cover everything. But we cover very little sport, we cover very little business and markets. That's because you don't have the resources to do all of that. Because if you scatter your resources everywhere, then your model becomes unsustainable. So maybe what Jeff Bezos is trying to say is that Washington Post should be a paper of Washington, the city and the capital should be a power paper with a particular ideological bent, maybe not strongly right, but a little bit right of center, or maybe on the center, not left, and forget about the rest of the world. It's not for us to fight for human rights in Gaza or what you might see as the quality of democracy in country A, B, C, D, E, F, X, Y, Z, etc., etc. We should focus on America. That's why the important thing is, while all the foreign bureaus, most of the foreign bureaus have been shut down, most of the regional bureaus in America have not been shut down. So see, the India Bureau, everybody has lost their job, everybody is laid off. Whereas Annie Gowan, who's a friend of mine also, she used to be the Washington Post correspondent in India. She is currently in Kansas. Her job is safe because the paper wants to cover America. So maybe it's a shift. It's a shift. The paper is beginning to look inwards. Or maybe Bezos and his councils think paper can only survive by looking inwards. It's spending too much money and resources trying to cover the entire world, or in wanting to make the world a better place. It's better to survive first. Donald Graham Jr., the son of the legendary Don Graham, Katharine Graham's husband, he sold the paper to Jeff Bezos. He has broken his silence and he's written what? A Facebook post. In the Facebook post he has said, see this on your screens, he says, now if the sports section goes, I will have to find a new way of reading the paper, because he set up the sports section in the paper in the 1940s. And he says, how can there be a paper without a sports section? And Marty Barron, I'm coming back to that. He says this ranks among the darkest days in the history of one of the world's greatest news organizations. This is a case study in instant self-inflicted brand destruction. Let's take a moment to look at how the Washington Post has been covering India. Some of Washington Post's correspondents to India have become legends, have become newsroom leaders in America. Steve Call, for example, he was correspondent for South Asia for quite some time. He wrote a bunch of really substantive books. These are not parachute journalist books that I went to India and I saw this in this place, this in this place. These are substantive books, particularly on the AFPAC region. Legend. And then became managing editor of the Washington Post at a young age, got his Pulitzers, and also headed the Columbia School of Journalism at Columbia University. These are people who, until a generation, came with a lot of homework before stepping into India. Some learned Hindi, some took crash courses in the politics, some went to a university, to the South Asia Studies Department to refresh themselves, to understand about the region. But not everybody did it. Not everybody did it. And this interest, the foreign press interest in India, waxed and waned. There was a time when India was a very poor country. The correspondents, NYT, Washington Post, etc., focused a lot more on that story and then kept on losing interest. A few things then brought this interest back. For example, the economic reform, a little bit, but not too much. But nuclear tests then. Nuclear tests, repeated warlike situations with Pakistan made India and the subcontinent a much bigger story. Then 9/11, then the Indo-US nuclear deal. This is when the foreign press's interest in India rose, particularly that of the American media. And I can tell you that at a time when Washington Post has really burnt down its bureau, I'm not even saying gutted. My first news editor in Indian Express in 1977, when I had gone to cover a slum area fire, I said all the juggies, all the slums were gutted. And he called me in and he said, describe to me what happened. He was a venerable old man. I said, sab jal ke bilkul raak ho gaya. So he said, dekho, wo huts hain, those are juggies. When they burn, they will burn down. They will not get gutted, right? Gutted means a factory catches fire, machines and furniture gets burned, but the factory is standing. So that is literally gutting it. What's happened right now is a gutting of the Washington Post because all of this from inside the Post has been pulled out and thrown away. But for New Delhi Bureau, it's a burning down. Now, this burning down of the New Delhi Bureau coincides with both the Financial Times and even more notably, the Economist actually adding to their India bureaus and increasing their India coverage. Now, why is it that they see benefit in doing this? They are not stupid people. They are also run by companies that have shareholders who ask questions. They are also not ideological. They don't have an agenda in India. They see value in India because probably they have a different view on India than some of the others. However, that's not something that we are going into right now. I'm just pointing out to you this contradiction, this very interesting contradiction. Why is Bezos doing what it's doing? Why does he have buyer's remorse? One possibility is that he and Elon Musk have been rivals for a long time. They hate each other's guts. He also wants to compete with Elon Musk in space. He's launched his own company, Blue Origin. In the New Yorker article, there's a very interesting reference. That's a reference to the movie Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane, at that point, among the richest people in the world, just as Jeff Bezos is. Citizen Kane, that is Charles Foster Kane, he's asked by his legal guardian, Walter Thatcher, that why are you spending so much money on this newspaper, free newspaper, an editorially free newspaper called The Inquirer? Why are you spending so much money on this newspaper? It's losing $1 million every year. Why are you doing it? And Citizen Kane then, that is Charles Foster Kane, answers his legal guardian, Walter Thatcher. He says, I lost $1 million the year before last, $1 million last year. I will lose another $1 million this year. Even if I keep on losing like this, the newspaper is okay to survive for 60 years. That was the Citizen Kane answer. And the authors of this article say that given the wealth that Bezos now has, even if he keeps on losing $100 million per year, it will take him 2 millennia to have Washington Post shut down. That is 2,000 years to have Washington Post shut down, which means it is not even a theoretical possibility. And that underlines to us again that for someone like Bezos, this is not a financial decision. This is a political and philosophical decision because he has other agendas and other ideas in life, and a free media organization, the ownership of which is traced to him, comes in his way. It's a stumbling block. That is the point we made. That is the point we made in this 50-word editorial also on the day the news came out that the Post was gutting itself. The basic story is that the great media legacies, the great independent media legacies have been built and protected by families that built them. When the families lose interest or the families run the businesses badly and someone else comes and buy it, then there is no guarantee that the organization or that the institution's character will be maintained. That is what makes it particularly challenging for people like us at The Print. One, we are not hyphenated. Second, we are not owned by any big business house. Third, we don't sell any news for anything. Even if one of our reporters goes on a trip on which the reporter is invited, we make a clear disclosure every time and prominently. Any conflict of interest or even a likely conflict of interest by a stretch is clearly demarcated and disclosed. To run journalism like this is very tough. You can see that even Jeff Bezos has struggled to run the Washington Post with his wealth. What is our wealth? Our wealth is just us, our people, our young journalists, and so many people like you who pay for this journalism. Without that, this cannot survive because good journalism is not necessarily a profit-making business. Even if it does make profit in the course of time, it will be a very tiny business. So no business person would run a newspaper business. It might be more profitable to run a chain of pawn shops or maybe franchise a chain of pawn shops. I say that without making any judgment on the business of pan making, pan selling or pan chewing. Although I might not particularly like pan, at the end of this episode on the Washington Post tragedy and crisis, I want to make this short point to you. The short point is that for an unhyphenated organization like ThePrint to sustain, and not just sustain but also grow. Because as Jeff Bezos told us, if you are not growing, if you are shrinking, then you will go into extinction. If we haven't hitched our wagon, ThePrint is not a wagon which is either hitched to an engine on the left, going left, or an engine going right. It can only run on fuel that all of you provided. That's why you value free press, you value an organization like ThePrint, you value what we give you in text, audio, video, etc. All of this will be possible only if you keep contributing. So instructions are on your screen as I speak. There is also a link with the description of this video. Please go there, pull out your credit card or open your favorite payment app or write a check. Each one of you then will be our Jeff Bezos without ever wanting to interfere in what we do editorially.